Welcome to Facing the Future, brought to you by the Concord Coalition on WKXL, New Hampshire's talk radio station. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Each week, we take a nonpartisan dive into topics related to the federal budget, the economy, and how it all affects our nation's future. This week, we welcome back to the show one of Washington's leading experts on the budget and the economy, former U.S. Senator Kent Conrad, Democrat of North Dakota. Conrad represented North Dakota in the U.S. Senate from 1992 to 2013. He served as chairman of the Senate Budget Committee from 2001 to 2003, and again from 2007 to 2013. He served as ranking member of the committee in between those years. And in addition, he served as chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, subcommittee on taxation, IRS oversight, and long-term growth. And he was significantly a member of the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, which you probably know as the Simpson-Bowles Commission. And he was a supporter in the Senate of those recommendations. And before being elected to the Senate, Conrad served as tax commissioner of North Dakota. He's now a member of the board of directors of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Also with me today is Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bordeaux. Senator Conrad, welcome back to Facing the Future.
It's always good to be with you, Bob, and good to be here to welcome Carolyn on board. We got our hands full.
Yeah, we certainly do. I know when to get out, I'll tell you. Anyway, I told the board of directors when the debt hits 30 trillion, I'm out of here. All right, so before we get to the budget, I understand that you and your family were doing some genealogical research and you found something, a very impressive connection. Tell us about it.
You know, we've always thought of ourselves as largely Scandinavian because we're mostly Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish, but we also have a French line. And so we planned a trip to France with my daughter and her husband, my wife and I. And my daughter decided to hire a genealogist to look into our background. And the first report she made to us, the genealogist, was that we are descendants of King Louis VIII, who was nicknamed the Lion. Not only was he king of France, but he also ruled a big chunk of England for a period of time. And then in her second report, she told us that we are cousins of the new Pope, Pope Leo. So, wow. Now, this raises the question of how I'm to be addressed. A lot of people are saying, Your Supreme Royal Eminence would be the appropriate way to introduce me. I don't know.
Now, it's too bad you're not, if you were still in the Senate, just Mr. Chairman would be fine. But I don't know if, I was wondering if you were back in the Senate. They call the subcommittee chairs of appropriations the Cardinals. So I guess you would clearly outrank the Cardinals now.
Oh, I think clearly.
Okay, well, that really is interesting, and it's impressive to have an American Pope with American relatives.
Yeah, we're inviting him to our next family reunion.
Well, that's terrific. Do you think you could get him on this show?
Well, what we'd like to do is get a Pope-mobile tour of New Hampshire.
Hey, there you go. Maybe we could put the debt clock on that. Well, all right. So, fun and games as the budget is shutting down. Well, Senator Conrad, it is amazing. We're bumping up against the deadline again, the end of the fiscal year, the end of September. And once again, we have no appropriation bills passed. They're going to have to rely on a continuing resolution. And it seems to me, and who knows, it may just go the whole year. It just seems to me that the whole budget process has broken down completely from the time that you were chairman and the budget committee. We just don't seem to do budgets anymore. I mean, so what do you think about that, and what are the consequences?
I think it's extremely unfortunate. Back in the day when Judd Gregg and I ran the budget committee, I was the lead Democrat, he was the lead Republican. We had a couple of rules that we abided by. One was, at the end of the day, we're going to produce a budget. and we're not going to play every game in the book in order to prevent that from happening on either side. Whether I was ranking member, the ranking Democrat, or the chairman, or Judd was the chairman or the ranking member, we would debate vigorously. We would have our disagreements. We would vote on amendments to change whatever package had been produced by who was ever chairman at the time. But at the end of the day, we would produce a result. And we did that. We never tried to trick each other or do the kind of stuff that's going on now, which is really, to me, utterly unprofessional. That's all I can say. I don't know how my colleagues can think they're doing their jobs when they don't produce a budget for the United States of America. That is just not acceptable.
Yeah. And don't do the approach. Go ahead, Carol, and jump in here.
I was going to say, yeah, it is a pretty poisonous atmosphere up there right now. Do you have any thoughts about what should be done to get it back on track?
Respect. It starts there. Judd Gregg and I, we had our disagreements. He's a Republican, I'm a Democrat. But we also had agreements that were even more important than our differences. And our agreement was the country was in fiscal trouble. Things were going off the rails. We were building up too much debt. And it was critically important to get back on track. And so, first of all, there was respect. Second of all, we actually listened to each other because neither side is right all of the time. I mean, that's just the hard reality. Democrats make mistakes, Republicans make mistakes. The key is to have the country moving in the right direction so that we enhance the opportunity for all Americans. And that should be the guiding light. And, one would hope we'd get away from this endless partisan sniping and really trivial sort of disagreements that stand in the way of what should be the broad goal of having America on track, heading upwards rather than down to the valley of debt, which will really hurt everybody's economic future.
I have a funny story about that kind of getting everybody to get along. We had a panel a few years ago of a bunch of CBO directors, and somebody asked them what could be done, and they said more bourbon. So, not sure that's the cure.
I was never much of a drinker, and we never did, like they did in the LBJ days. Lyndon B. Johnson, when he was Senate leader, he would have these sessions, and it would be after hours, and they'd drink a lot of bourbon.
Yeah.
And that seemed to help the medicine go down.
Yeah, they referenced the drink carts that they'd pull out.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Well, you talk about, trust, and one of the things that is holding things up this year is kind of a fight over the power of the purse. I mean, this administration has a very aggressive attitude about the administration's power on spending, and they're taking the attitude that even when Congress passes appropriations bills, the administration can refuse to spend the money if they don't want to, and that's holding up, agreement because the Democrats are afraid that they might make a deal, but then the administration would refuse to spend the money. It just seems to me that Congress is ceding too much of its power of the purse these days.
The Constitution is very clear. Very clear. The power of the purse resides in the Congress of the United States, not in the White House, not in the presidency, but in the Congress of the United States. That is what the Constitution provides, and it does it for very good reason. They did not want to have happen in America what happened in Europe, where leaders became despots, where those who were in charge of a country became kings above everyone. They didn't want that to happen in this country, and we've got to be very careful that it doesn't happen here. So that is the key reason that our founding fathers put the power of the purse in the Congress of the United States rather than in the executive. They wanted a balance of power, They did not want a president who was over everyone else or over every other institution, over the courts, over the Congress. They wanted co-equal branches of government, and they did it for very good reasons. Because in the past, in Europe, as I've said, where we wound up with kings who ruled over everyone and over everything, led to endless war, endless conflict, and mass slaughter. That's what happened in Europe. We ought to learn that lesson.
Well, I think that issue is going to be before the Supreme Court before the end of the year on this issue of pocket rescissions, which is a rescission before Congress goes out, and then they have no opportunity to act on it, and then the money goes away. And that is, as far as I can tell, unconstitutional based on the line item veto case from several years ago. But I'm sure the Supreme Court will give us their opinion on that. Senator Conrad, I'm going to have to take the first break here.
Sure.
And then we'll be right back. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bourdeaux and I are talking with former U.S. Senator from North Dakota, Kent Conrad, former chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bourdeaux and I are talking with former U.S. Senator Kent Conrad, Democrat of North Dakota, former chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. Senator Conrad, we were talking about the power of the purse in the first segment, and specifically we were talking about spending. There's also a power of the purse question coming up about revenues, and that's in the form of tariffs. The current administration is, as we know, a big fan of tariffs and has imposed many. And they've actually begun to bring in quite a bit of revenue. I mean, there's been a substantial amount of revenue raised, over 100 billion, 135 billion or so, I think, so far this year in revenues. And the CBO projected that if you just kept all this stuff in place over 10 years, it could bring in over $3 trillion. So that's serious money. But I mean, there are questions about the legality, about the particular tariffs that have been put in place. That issue is before the court because tariffs are revenue, and Congress has the revenue power as well as the spending power. And so there's that issue, and there's also the issue about whether or not this is reliable revenue. If tariffs are a negotiating tactic, is that money that's going to be coming in, or is it going to just sort of come and go? So I just wanted to get your thoughts as a member of the Finance Committee on our tariff situation.
So, if we look again at history, we've seen this movie before. In 1930, the United States imposed the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs then led to other countries retaliating, and ultimately it reduced world trade by almost 2/3, deepening the Depression. This is the history of tariffs that are imposed, that are not imposed for the purpose of rectifying a wrong that a country is committing in trade policy, but to raise huge amounts of revenue and to do it in the way that's being done here. So I'm not a fan of tariffs. I think anybody that studied economic history would understand the incredible risk that you run of other countries retaliating at reducing trade, reducing economic opportunity and economic growth, job opportunity, and all of the rest. So I think it's a mistake for a president to impose these kinds of tariffs and to do it without congressional authorization, which is what has been done here. There's a reason we have a Congress. There's a reason. There's a reason we have courts. And the reason for the three branches of government, which were meant to be co-equal branches of government, was to prevent a dictatorship, to prevent a king, to prevent the kind of unchecked power that our European forefathers saw over and over that led to disastrous results. One of the things I'd like to add, Bob, is, we hear about the big, beautiful bill that was just passed. I think that's misnamed. It should have been called the Big Budget Buster,
Yeah.
Because what they have done is add $4 trillion of debt at a time when we already have $37 trillion of debt in this country. They've added another 4 trillion when economic times are relatively good. This is a time we ought to be paying down debt instead of adding to it. That debt is now 123% of our gross domestic product, as you know, maybe a little more than that. So our debt is larger than the total size of our economic activity. And we know from history, once you get over about 80% of GDP in a debt, you start running risks. And what are the risks that you run? I think it's very important for people to understand why debt and deficits make a difference. It's because over time, when you run up debt, you reduce societal savings. When you reduce societal savings, you reduce money that's available for investment. When you reduce investment, you reduce economic growth. When you reduce economic growth, you reduce people's opportunities to better their own economic lives. So all of these things are connected. And to add $4 trillion of debt when Social Security and Medicare are on the brink of insolvency. We know from the trustees, Social Security is headed for insolvency in 2032. That's just 7 years away. What happens when Social Security is insolvent? The law provides that at that point, everyone taking Social Security, getting Social Security, will take a 24% cut. That's what happens. This is reality talking. These are the facts. That's especially important to understand that 50% of seniors get more than 50% of their income from Social Security. 50% of seniors get more than half of their income from Social Security. 25% of seniors get more than 90% of their income from Social Security. Can you imagine if in 7 years all those people take a 24% cut, which is what the law provides? So, we got to sober up here in this country and understand there are real consequences with a failure to deal with this debt. And that's why anybody who is watching should care about deficits and debt. I know, we've just had this massive run up under Trump, the previous Trump administration. He added 8 trillion to the debt. Then Biden did about the same. Those two alone have accounted for nearly half of all the debt of the United States. So there are real consequences here, and it's something we all should care about because it affects our combined and collective economic future.
Well, you have always said the debt is the threat, and that's why. Carolyn, you want to jump in here?
Well, yeah, I was gonna. One of our challenges is I've been visiting with my former colleagues as a member of Congress and visiting with them on the Hill recently, and we talked about polarization and really how hard it is to get people together. Everybody, I think, up there sees the problem, but they have no strategy for figuring out how to overcome the politics to get together to try to solve it, and in a sense, jump off the cliff together, hold hands and address it. So everybody is afraid if they put out an idea, for instance, around entitlement reform or tax reform or something like that, that the other side will just use that to savage them politically. Any thoughts about a first step here to try to get everybody on the same page?
I go back to the time that I was chairman of the budget committee and Judd Gregg was the ranking member. We were on a trip together, and he and his wife and my wife and I sat together during that trip. And we came up with the idea of the Simpson-Bowles Commission. And we came up with what that commission would be charged with, what the membership might look like. And when we got back to the States, I entered into negotiations with the then Obama administration, specifically Vice President Biden and the Secretary of the Treasury in that administration, on the formulation of the Simpson-Bowles Commission. And the idea was to come up with a comprehensive plan that would get us back on track on both the revenue and the spending side, reduce spending, raise revenue, do it in a way that was friendly to the strong economic functioning of America, to do it in a way that would get the result over time so America could get back on track. So we could enhance economic growth, economic opportunity, job creation, and all the rest of the things that flow when you've got a fiscally responsible budget. And we then took that to our colleagues. And our colleagues ultimately did not approve giving the authority to put together that commission. So then we convinced the Obama administration to name that commission using their executive authority. And that led to 2 years of work in the Simpson-Bowles Commission and came up with a plan to get America back on track. If that plan had been instituted, America would be in a far different position today. Instead of adding to the debt, we would have the debt under control. So that was a huge missed opportunity. But there's a lesson there. And to me, the lesson is the only way this is going to happen is an independent commission, bipartisan, with both sides participating fully, to come back with a plan, a comprehensive plan to get America back on track. And I hope we do that, and I hope we do it sooner rather than later.
Just
we got to take our second break here. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bourdeau and I are talking with former U.S. Senator Kent Conrad, Democrat of North Dakota, former chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bourdeau and I are talking with former U.S. Senator Kent Conrad, Democrat of North Dakota, former chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. And we're talking about what else? We're talking about the problems with the federal budget and the unsustainable debt, was something that Senator Conrad has been warning about for a long time and trying to do something about. So before the break, we were talking about a potential commission. Carolyn, I think you had some follow-up questions.
Okay, so a fiscal commission. When I talk to people about this, they roll their eyes and they say, "Oh my goodness, we have studied this issue enough." What distinguishes a commission from just another study group that looks at the budget and puts ideas on the table?
Well, let me just say, I entirely agree with those who say we've studied this enough. This isn't a study group. This is a commission to come up with a recommendation to get us back on track, and a specific recommendations that involve both the spending and the revenue side of the equation, that deals with both entitlements, things like Social Security and Medicare, that also addresses discretionary spending, which is spending that's approved by the Congress every year, unlike Medicare and Social Security that are locked in based on their previous authorizations. So this is a commission designed to come up with a solution, not to study, to come up with a solution that then is guaranteed a vote in the House and the Senate of the United States, so that we give members a chance to vote to get us back on track. Now, this would be a very unpopular vote because you got to have more revenue, you got to have less spending. I mean, it's a mathematical certainty that that's what's required when you're running these massive debts. You've got to deal with both sides of the equation, both spending and with revenue. And I can tell you, the spending programs in the United States are popular. Having tax cuts is popular. Doing something that would affect spending and affect revenue in a way to reduce debt is not particularly popular, but one unpopular vote could get us back on track. We've done it before. We did it with Social Security back in the days of Tip O'Neill, Bob Dole, and they saved Social Security. it can be done again because, as I say, 7 years from now, 2032, according to the trustees, according to the Congressional Budget Office, Social Security is going to be insolvent. And at that point, the law provides that there will have to be a 24% cut across the board in Social Security. That's where we're headed. And the longer we wait, the more draconian the solutions will have to be.
Can you talk a little bit about the rules process and how you get to this expedited vote? There is, and I think everybody should understand, the idea is you're going to put together a proposal, a package, and then it will go to the floor of the House and the Senate and will get an expedited vote. But how does that actually happen? Can you just give us a little taste of the mechanics of that?
So it requires Congress to act to set the conditions that would allow for an expedited procedure, one in which there would be time for debate, time for amendments, but at the end of that time, there would be the certainty of a vote. And, I got to say, having been a member of the United States Senate, I was actually a member of the Senate for 26 years. I actually started my Senate service in 1987, but I served my first term in a seat, and then I did not run for reelection to that seat. I was reelected in a special election after 6 years, and then served just 2 years before then renewing a 6-year cycle. So I'm the only senator in history that served in both Senate seats from the same state in the same day. So I'm the answer to a trivia question if anybody ever asks.
All right. You know a few things about the rules. One last question I often get is, would it be subject to the filibuster?
Well, it depends entirely on how Congress sets up the rules of engagement here. I personally believe when we did Bowles-Simpson, we had it set up so that it took a supermajority vote in order to pass Simpson-Bowles. It took a supermajority vote. So that, in a way, takes care of the question of a filibuster, okay, which requires a supermajority vote to proceed.
One question that I had too about the commission is some commission proposals do have a provision for a public engagement exercise or campaign along with the commission's work. So you bring the public along. Is that something that you would support?
Very much so. And in Simpson-Bowles, as you'll recall, Alan Simpson, senator from Wyoming, Republican, Erskine Bowles, who had been chief of staff to President Clinton, had also been head of the Small Business Administration, went all across the country holding hearings, giving the public a chance for input. And members of the commission, I did this in my state and participated in other states. Judd Gregg did as well. And we had public hearings in Washington as well. But really, we went all across the country asking the American people for their input. And it's, the American people have a lot of good ideas when they're given a chance to say what they think. And it's just common sense that you don't continue to run up debt when the debt that you already have is 123% of the size of your economy. Most everybody in the country acknowledges, well, wait a minute, we're headed for the cliff.
I had that reminds me of an experience that I had a few years ago. You invited me out to North Dakota for a town hall meeting that you were having with constituents. And on the panel was a representative from AARP and somebody from a college student, somebody local. I think we were meeting at a college. And I was really, you had me there to give the bad news and the charts and, the scary numbers, which I was happy to do. And then, there was this panel discussion. What was really interesting to me was that during the panel discussion, The AARP representative said what concerned her most about the debt was what it would do to her grandchildren. And she was really worried about our fiscal situation because of her grandchildren. When the student talked, he said what worried him was that we would do things that would hurt his grandparents, that we would cut Medicare or Social Security or something like that. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. We think of people as being selfish, representing their own interests and that other thing. When it comes to the debt, there's a lot of intergenerational concern about each other, at least among your constituents.
I can tell you during Simpson Bowles, the executive head of AARP came to see me. And he told me that if we could reach agreement on a bipartisan basis on a plan to get the country back on track, that AARP would put up very substantial resources to help explain the proposal to the American people and to support its passage. I've never said this publicly before, but that occurred. And the reason they were willing to do that, even knowing that there would be some changes in both Medicare and Social Security to help get us back on track, because they understood the larger truth, that if we didn't, that at some point we would face what we face today. That is, in 7 years, that everybody is going to take a 24% cut in their Social Security because the program is insolvent. What does that mean to be insolvent? It doesn't mean that nobody gets any Social Security. It means that you can only fund Social Security to the extent you have revenue to cover the outlays, to cover the spending. And we know that in 7 years, Social Security revenue will be able to pay out 76% of what's been promised. Not 100%, 76%. That's what will require a 24% cut for all Social Security recipients. So, hey, we can just keep heading for the cliff and not pay any attention to what happens, or we can deal with it. Most people are mature enough to know that it's better to deal with the problem earlier rather than later.
Yeah, I mean, the problem only gets worse. And, it's not something you can borrow your way out of, because the gap gets bigger and bigger between dedicated revenue and promised benefits. So we're going to have to take our last break. We're talking, Carolyn Bourdeaux, Executive Director of the Concord Coalition, and I are talking with Senator Kent Conrad, former senator from North Dakota and former chairman of the Budget Committee and longtime deficit hawk and relative of Pope Leo. So he knows what he's talking about. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bourdeaux and I are talking with former U.S. Senator Kent Conrad of North Dakota, and we're talking about some budget process issues. Carolyn, you got a question.
All right. Well, we're talking about things to get Congress back on track. We have discussed bourbon. We discussed the Fiscal Commission. One other change that we are looking at as an organization is reinstating the Conrad rule, which was a reconciliation-based rule named after you. And so I was hoping you'd talk a little bit about what that was and a little of the history of it, perhaps.
So the Conrad rule simply stated you could not use reconciliation, which is a special fast-track procedure which avoids the filibuster. You could not use reconciliation to add to the debt. The only reason reconciliation was ever created was to reduce deficits and debt. A special fast-track procedure that would avoid the filibuster, designed to reduce deficits and debt. Instead, it has been stood on its head, and now reconciliation, the special fast-track procedure that avoids the possibility of a filibuster, which would require 60 votes in the United States Senate to overcome. That has been absolutely eviscerated. And instead, reconciliation, this special fast track procedure, is using to increase deficits and debt. Again, at a time when we're headed for insolvency of Social Security and Medicare, not in the sweet by and by, but in the very near future. And that will have enormous consequences for our country. So the Conrad
How did it
rules
come to be named after you?
Well, because I instituted it. I put it in place. And it was because I was trying to keep faith with what my colleagues had done in the past who created reconciliation for the express purpose of reducing deficits and debt, not to have this special procedure to increase deficits and debt. I mean, it's so wildly irresponsible, if you think about it, to be doing what's been done here. We have $37 trillion of debt. 123% of our gross domestic product is debt. And they are using a special fast track procedure to avoid the usual rules of the Senate in order to pass legislation to increase even further the deficits and debt of the country. I mean, it stands logic on its head. One thing I wanted to add before we end is, you know, New Hampshire has produced two great budget heroes. Senator Warren Rudman, who was fundamental to having a Concord coalition, a really extraordinary man, a man of deep integrity, and Judd Gregg. Judd Gregg, who will leave a legacy of playing a central role in getting us out of the 2008 financial crisis. He was on the committee, as was I, to come up with a plan to prevent us from going into a depression. And I served every day on that group with Judd Gregg. I saw him in action, showing enormous courage, political courage, to prevent the country from going into a depression. So to me, New Hampshire has produced two of the real fiscal heroes of American history in Senator Warren Rudman and Senator Judd Gregg.
Well, thank you for. I can't speak for New Hampshire, but I will say, on behalf of New Hampshire, thank you for those comments. And I certainly agree with you. I worked with Senator Rudman on the Concord Coalition from the beginning, and had the privilege of working with Senator Gregg on a few issues. And in fact, you and Senator Gregg did a forum together in New Hampshire with me at one point. I remember doing, and that was a lot of fun. So yes, New Hampshire has a kind of a fiscal responsibility gene.
Yeah,
that,
I think New Hampshire really does. I don't know. I think it's much like North Dakota in many ways.
yeah.
People are practical, and they understand that spending money you don't have has consequences. And they may not be immediate. They may not be in the immediate have immediate effect, but over the long term, these things have consequences.
Well,
And you can
that
either
kind of
put your head in the sand or you can deal with it.
leads me to my next question, which is, why aren't financial markets or CEOs, business community more concerned? Maybe they are, but you don't sense it, that they're not really looking ahead that far.
You know, I think it's the difference between immediate threat and longer term threat. Um, these imbalances don't have an immediate effect. We see that in history. They don't have an effect until they do. And you're cruising along. It's like I liken it to a family with credit card debt. And I used to be the tax commissioner of my state. In my state, the tax commissioner is elected. And I was elected at a time of deep economic distress in farm country back in the 80s when we were experiencing an agricultural recession, perhaps even a depression. And people would come to me and show me their credit cards. I remember people coming and showing me they had $126,000 of credit card debt. Absolutely no way of ever paying it back. And, you know, they could run it up month after month after month until they no longer could. The same is really true of a country. You can run up debt for a long time before the roof falls in, but ultimately it does. This is undeniable. This is the economic history we've all learned. That's why debt matters, because while it may not create an immediate problem, over the longer term, it does. And that's why it's so critical we deal with it now, because as I've indicated, in just 7 years, Social Security is going to be insolvent. Everybody's going to take a 24% cut. Hello? Are we listening? Are we paying attention? Are we just thinking about the short term, the immediate? Or do we have the vision to understand where this is all headed? And I think most people in the country, I'm confident most people in New Hampshire and North Dakota understand that dealing with problems earlier rather than later makes it easier to solve the problem. One other thing I should emphasize on markets, there is another factor here that is having an enormous impact on markets, and that's the opportunity represented by artificial intelligence. Most CEOs that I talk to understand that we are headed down a path that makes no sense, where things don't add up and we keep adding to the debt, even when times are good. You know, this is what's most amazing. We've got a $37 trillion debt. We've just added $4 trillion to the debt when times are good, even though we're hurtling towards insolvency in Medicare and Social Security. That is really an astounding fact. But there is also this other element that is out there that promises huge opportunity in terms of increases in productivity. Economic growth is based on two things. One, your labor supply, and number two, your productivity growth. Any economist will tell you those are the factors that determine economic growth, therefore economic opportunity. And artificial intelligence promises huge leaps forward in productivity. And if we have an ample labor supply, which is also a critical question, then we will have strong economic growth that will help deal with these longer term imbalances in our budgets. But that still requires us to take action. Because right now, as I've said, even though times are good, we're running up massive new debt on top of debt that is already too big.
Yeah, and it manifests itself in interest costs. I mean, if people want a metric of it, the interest costs on the debt were more than defense last year, and just about the same as Medicare. I mean, it's a sort of the two are about the same. And I don't think people really think about that interest on the debt and Medicare are the same. And
this year, the interest cost to the United States because of this debt is going to be larger than any spending in the federal budget other than Social Security. As a former budget committee chairman, I can tell you that has enormous implications for how you write a budget. If the first two things you have to do is pay Social Security, which of course you do, and the next biggest thing, the biggest bill you've got to cover is interest on the debt, that affects what you can spend on every other priority, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's childcare, whether it's national parks, law enforcement, national defense. All of those things have to be reduced because you're spending more and more on interest on the debt. Again, this year, the second biggest expenditure by the federal government will be interest on the debt, second only to Social Security. More than defense, it'll be more than Medicare, it'll be more than any other federal priority.
And we're going to have to leave it there, but that is why you have always said the debt is the threat. And but we're going to have to. That's all the time we have for this week. Maybe that will. Maybe that's a good thing, given where we are, I guess. But you've been listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bordeaux and I have been talking with former U.S. Senator Kent Conrad, Democrat of North Dakota, about the budget and the economy and the future. Senator Conrad, thanks for being our guest.
You bet. And we can do this. We can do this. We can get back on track. We just have to make some tough decisions.
That's a good place to leave it. And I'll be back next week with another edition of Facing the Future.